Hey guys, wanted to talk today about a mod for Crosman air pistols, and this is the Polytube transfer port mod. Essentially what you're doing is replacing the transfer port valve and O-ring, which I have here. I don't have the valve, and you're going to just replace that with a small piece of 1/4 inch Polytube. The reason you want to do that is if you had previously made power modifications such as a flat top piston and valve, anything to your main valve like angling the porthole, removing some of the inner material to create more volume, even something like an extended bolt probe or a hollow bolt probe. Those are all mods that are designed to increase air flow and volume, and they all kind of work together to give you an optimized amount of higher air pressure and volume and better air flow. So all throughout the whole process, from the actual valve into the barrel, you want to optimize that and create as large of an air channel as possible and the best, most efficient flow of air. So the thing about the stock transfer port is that it's pretty small. So this is actually widening it, probably somewhere around maybe like 25% wider, which doesn't seem like much, but it will increase your airflow and give you higher velocity in the end. So basically all you need is a piece of 1/4 inch Polytube, and you're only going to be using a small portion of it, so only about 1/3 of an inch or 1/2 of an inch to start, so you don't need much. You will need some tools. Ideally you want to use a drill press. You can probably already see here that this hole that I drilled is imperfect because I used a hand drill, cordless drill. That's all I have. I don't have a drill press. So the thing about that is if you're not going to use a drill press, there is a chance that you can irreparably ruin your barrel. I just so happen to have an extra barrel. This top gray one is the stock barrel, and this extra one I actually made from a 24-inch barrel I purchased from Crosman. So it was just an extra, and I figured I'd try this out, and if I screwed it up, no big deal. But if you only have one barrel and you're using a handheld drill, be prepared that you may ruin it if you don't know what you're doing. So starting out, basically all you're doing is just widening the existing holes in your transfer port hole. In this case I had to start from scratch because none of this was here, because this was a front end of a barrel that was cut in half. But you start out with your 11/64, drill the first hole, and then you countersink it with a 1/4 inch drill bit, and you go about halfway down so that you get something that looks like this, where you have a larger hole in the outer diameter and then a smaller inner hole, and you can see between the two that this one's much wider. Okay, and what that'll do is that'll fit this little piece of Polytube. And this tubing, it gets warped and bent, so but once you kind of press it into shape and assemble the gun, it'll fit pretty good. You can see it holds in there. So even though that outer hole looks kind of rough, the fact that it fits in and holds, as long as that inner countersunk part is fairly true and you've got enough lip all the way around, it's going to fit and sit with that piece of polytubing. So that's probably going to work. Now I can't tell you exactly what the length of this piece should be, because like I said, I did this by hand and I don't know how deep I went into the barrel. So what I'm going to end up doing is I'll just cut it as flat as I can on one side. You want it nice and perpendicular, and you'll want to use a razor for that. And then take something like a Dremel or even a file and just run that piece of tubing across it to remove material. And this is when you're actually assembling the gun. And just do little by little, put it on there, see if it fits, see how close you are, remove a little more material, and just do like a custom fit like that. I can't say to just, cut it at a certain length and it's good to go. You'll probably want to just tweak it, unless you're using calipers and machines and you're getting everything exactly right from the beginning. You're probably going to just want to do it, just eye it, and just sand it down little by little. So what that does is, like I said, it's replacing the rubber O-ring, which actually goes into the tube of the main body of the gun and sits directly on the valve. So you won't need that anymore. Instead, this little piece of polytube will sit directly on the valve, and it'll sit flush. It'll go through the tube and actually touch the valve. And the valves are flattened there. They're not rounded. So you want a nice flush perpendicular edge or end on your piece of polytubing so it fits flush against that valve. So basically the polytube will be sandwiched between your barrel and the valve, and then you'll have increased airflow going from the old hole to the larger 11/16. And you can see it fits on the end of that drill bit, and you can actually, if you want to use that as a guide when you're filing it, you can use the drill bit itself to get that nice and flush. So that's pretty much it. Next we'll look at what the actual assembly looks like, and then I'll show you how that all fits. We're ready to assemble now. And just to recap, I've got my piece of polytube. It's a 1/4 inch polytube in diameter, and the actual length ended up being 7/32 of an inch. And it's going to be replacing the transfer port and the O-ring transfer port seal. And you want to have the gun in this state of disassembly. So you've got your breech in and everything. I'm sorry, your hammer, spring, trigger assembly, and grip is on. Your valves there, your valves right there. And you're basically just taking your piece of polytube, and it should fit nice and snug into that hole. And this is the tricky part. So I've got my barrel band on. Now, since I'm using a plastic breech, there isn't a grub screw there that there normally is on the steel breech, so this is free to rotate. So that is going to add a degree of difficulty, because that's going to want to move on us. So we're taking our barrel band here. Just put that in there, and I'm just going to use a drill bit for now to hold that in place. See, everything wants to get out of whack here. You should hear that click into place like that. And it really shouldn't rotate too much. It may have a little bit of wiggle, but it shouldn't rotate freely anymore. Okay, once we got that on there, we're going to want to put our top rear breech screw in. So hold that down and on. And then we need to cock it, and we'll be putting in the little tiny screw that goes in the bolt slide area. Now I'm using a custom made barrel, so it might not fit exactly as good as a stock barrel. Being very careful not to strip that. Putting a lot of downward pressure. Don't over tighten, but make sure it's tight. Okay. So barrel is wiggling a little bit. Now we'll take out the wiggle once we tighten up the grub screws inside the barrel band. But that just goes to show why these plastic breeches suck, because they just allow too much slop. So I may end up having to replace that with the steel breech. But if that poly tube wasn't in there right, the barrel would pull right out. So the poly tube itself is what's holding it in there, because nothing else is. The barrel isn't locked in the barrel band yet. So it's basically in there now. And everything looks pretty good. Alright, so that's pretty much it for the assembly of that polytube transfer port. I'll just have to put on the pump arm and piston, and should be good to go at that point, and then we'll do some test shooting and see how she works.